everybody, to Tokens of Wisdom. I am your host, Dave Rothschild, and before I dive into today's very exciting topic, please remember to listen to the disclaimer at the end of the show. Nothing I say here is legal advice, tax advice, or investment advice. So I've got a quick housekeeping episode for all you investment advisors out there today. As you've probably heard from countless law firm memos and compliance consultant emails, the SEC has increased the qualified client threshold. The effective date of the increase is at the end of June 29th, 2026, so it's mere weeks away. That's right, if you charge a performance allocation, or heck, even if you're an investor in a fund that charges a performance allocation, this may affect you. It's not complicated, but the deadline is real, and the numbers have gone up quite a bit, so let's get into it. And yes, I'm going to make an inflation-related joke, so prepare yourselves accordingly. Now, let's set the scene a little bit here. What exactly is a qualified client, and why does it matter? Well, as all veteran Tokens of Wisdom listeners doubtless know, if you're a registered investment advisor, then you can't charge any performance-based compensation. I'm talking about performance fees, performance allocations, carried interest, any other synonym you can think of for performance-based compensation, unless the client you're charging that comp to is a qualified client. Now, before you turn me out completely because you're an exempt reporting advisor, thus not registered and thus not subject to this Advisors Act rule, you should know that many state ERA statutes, the statutes that enable the exemption on which you rely, also fold in a qualified client requirement. These vary by state. Not every state does it, but a lot of states do. California, for example, basically just mimics the SEC's rule and says that if you're a California-based manager, you're relying on California's ERA statute, you can only charge performance-based compensation to investors who are qualified clients. Other states go even further. Looking at you, Massachusetts. Looking at you, Texas, ye state of classic overregulation. Yes, those states require that every investor in your fund be a qualified client, whether you charge them performance-based compensation or not, if you're going to rely on their ERA statutes. So call your lawyer, figure out what rules apply to you. This QC threshold may matter to you, even if you don't think that it does. Now, that's why the qualified client threshold matters. What is the threshold, actually? There are two primary ways that an investor could meet the qualified client threshold. The first is what we call the AUM test. The AUM test says you're a qualified client if you invest at least X dollars with a given manager. The second is the net worth test. It says that you're a qualified client if your net worth, excluding the value of your primary residence and related indebtedness, is at least Y dollars, then you are a qualified client. Well, it looks like both X and Y have been eating their spinach because they are bulking up considerably. Now, quick aside here, I want to note that any qualified purchaser, which is generally a much higher threshold of accreditation, is also a qualified client. So that's kind of a third way that you can meet the qualified client definition. I'm not going to talk that much about it here because that isn't changing at the end of June. What is changing at the end of June is the X and the Y, the AUM test and the net worth test. And the reason it's changing is actually written directly in the statute that created the qualified client threshold in the first place. That's right. Every 5 years, the SEC has to update the AUM test and the net worth test to keep pace with inflation. And so like I alluded to before, these numbers are going up quite a bit. But if you've been to the grocery store lately or the gas station, the size of the increase may not surprise you. So what are the new numbers? Well, the AUM test is moving from $1.1 million to $1.4 million. It's up $300,000 in this latest update. What that means is that after June 29th, 2026, in order to be a qualified client under that AUM test, you have to have at least $1.4 million under the management of the advisor whose fund you're investing into. How about the net worth test? Well, it's going up even more. It's going from $2.2 million to $2.7 million. That's a $500,000 increase. Net worth, it should be noted, is measured at the time of entering into the advisory agreement. So when you sign the subdocs or when you sign the IMA, and like I said earlier, it excludes the value of your primary residence and the indebtedness you incurred related to buying that primary residence. For a little historical context, this is the third time since the QC threshold was introduced in 2011 that it will be increased. In 2016 and in 2021, the net worth prong increased each year by $100,000. So this year's $500,000 increase is a substantially larger one than we've ever seen before. If you didn't believe your own eyes about inflation, time to believe the SEC's. Now, there is a grandfathering rule that's important to remember. This is the part that really trips people up, and it's also the good news in this whole story, so please do pay attention. These new increased thresholds apply to clients that are admitted into your fund on or after June 29th, 2026. So if you have an investor in your fund who joined today, yesterday, last month, and they met the qualified client thresholds as they existed when they invested, those folks are grandfathered. They can remain in your fund. You can keep charging them performance allocations. They can make additional capital contributions to your fund. You don't have to get them to re-represent that they meet the new higher thresholds that are going into effect at the end of June. So that's great news. The one thing to keep in mind is, if an LP comes to you and says they want to transfer their fund interest to somebody else, or if you admit a new investor after the increases go into effect, that's when you have to get those new investors to represent that they meet the higher thresholds. Now, obviously, anytime someone's transferring an interest in your fund from themselves to someone else, you as the manager, as a condition to approving that transfer, should make that new transferee fill out your then current subscription documents so that you have all the information about them. And of course, as a prudent manager, you will have updated your subscription documents to include the new higher thresholds. So this really shouldn't be an issue for you, but keep it on your radar nonetheless. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds super fun and exciting. What do I actually need to do? And here is the second bit of good news from today's episode, and that is really not all that much. What you definitely need to do is go through your subscription docs and your advisory agreements, your IMAs, and update the qualified client thresholds. Update the AUM test, update the net worth test. Again, the AUM test is going up to, checking my notes, $1.4 million, and the net worth test is going up to $2.7 million. Very irritating, hard to remember numbers that everyone will probably get wrong for a little while, but I digress. So update the QC thresholds in your subscription documents and in any other advisory agreements. If those thresholds are written out in compliance manuals or marketing materials or any other document that you maintain and use in your business, you should update the numbers there too. And the last thing I'll mention is that you should have on your radar any pending closings. Like if you're mid fundraise right now and you're targeting a June 28th closing, here's a little news flash. You might not have heard this before, but sometimes closings get pushed by a few days. So if you're even close to straddling that line, I would suggest collecting representations from your investors based on the new higher thresholds, and then you're not going to be scrambling come June 30th when that closing slips and you've got to go back to investors and get new subdocs. The bottom line in all this is a routine increase. It happens every 5 years, but the amount of the increase is kind of turbocharged this year. Thank you, politics. So definitely update your subdocs and your advisory agreements. Make sure they have the accurate qualified client thresholds moving forward. And maybe keep your X's and Y's away from the spinach aisle at the grocery store. Well, now that all that boring stuff's out of the way, it's time for the part you've all been waiting for. The legal disclaimer. In this show, I describe laws and regulations from a 10,000-foot view. And while this should be obvious to most, I need to say it nonetheless. This show is for informational purposes only, and nothing I say here constitutes legal, investment, or tax advice. If you're thinking about starting a fund or you're curious about your options, this show is a good resource. But if you're going to pull the trigger and launch a fund, please engage an attorney to assist you.